Buddy, that's...
No, Daddy, roll!
Paul and Peter grew up in a family where crime wasn't just a habit, it was a way of life. Their parents taught them how to steal instead of how to read bedtime stories.
Some families have a long line of
So, when we first meet them, they're busy cracking open a safe, eager to prove their skills. When they show their mother, Olivia, what they've done, she's over the moon. To her, this is proof that her sons are finally ready for bigger, riskier jobs.
$38, shithead.
But just as they start celebrating, Olivia drops a bombshell. I'm leaving, and you're never going to see me again. Years ago, Olivia and her boyfriend pulled off a huge heist, but things went sideways when the cops showed up and shot him. Since then, she had been secretly hiding him in their home, nursing his wounds while keeping their location under wraps. But now, the law had finally caught up. With no other choice, she vanished with her boyfriend, leaving Paul and Peter to survive on their own.
Look at me.
The brothers kept doing what they knew best, stealing. One night, they set up a big job, planning everything down to the last detail. They talked about Olivia as they worked, still bitter about how she abandoned them. While Paul worked on picking a lock, Peter stood outside,
You got this.
keeping watch. Then, out of nowhere, a cop showed up and started questioning Peter. Trying to play it cool, Peter gave the most ridiculous answers, hoping the officer would write him off as some random weirdo.
Sir?
But when the cop moved to arrest him, Paul jumped in and knocked the guy out. They made a run for it, but as soon as they reached the exit, they saw flashing lights everywhere. The cops had them surrounded. In the chaos, Peter got caught, but Paul managed to escape. Years later, Peter was still behind bars, but he got an early release by cutting a deal with a corrupt prison officer named Albert.
Knock me out, Fireful? Still.
The catch, Albert had a job for him. If Peter didn't do it, he'd end up back in his cell. Turns out, Albert's father was a judge, and with his connections, Peter's release had been arranged as part of a bigger scheme.
You down? You give me a little poke.
Peter knew he was being used, but he had no choice but to go along with it. Meanwhile, Paul had left crime behind. He got a legit job, got married, and was about to become a father. Life seemed good until his past came back to bite him. His boss found out about his criminal history and fired him on the spot. No matter how much Paul tried to explain that he had changed, no one cared. On that very same day, Peter showed up at Paul's house after years of silence.
You ordered a clown.
Paul was shocked to see him, and even more surprised when Peter explained how he got out. He told Paul about the job Albert was forcing him into, stealing some diamonds. If he refused, it was straight back to prison. Then Peter turned to Paul and said, "Come on, man.
Is it? Or don't call.
With your skills, we can do this easy." Paul refused without a second thought. He had a family now and wasn't about to go back to the life they had grown up in. Instead, he offered Peter some food, saying, "I'm having a little party tonight. If you're hungry, come inside." Peter, who hadn't had a decent meal in years, couldn't say no. At the party, he got a little drunk and started chatting with a stranger, which made Paul furious.
Here's what's up.
In a rage, Paul threw him out. Peter found a hotel for the night, thinking maybe his luck would turn around. Nope. Albert showed up furious. He punched Peter and said, I gave you a job, and instead, you're out here messing around?" Peter tried to explain, "I was just gathering a crew." But Albert wasn't buying it. He pressed Peter's fingerprints onto a gun and threatened, "Either you do the job, or this gun ends up in police hands and you go back to prison for life." Shortly after Albert left, Paul came looking for Peter.
Regal.
What?
Seeing his brother all beat up, Paul knew something was up. Peter admitted everything. He was trapped, and if he didn't follow through with the heist, he was done for. Paul sighed and finally gave in. "Fine, I'll help you." Peter was thrilled. "It's just a 2-day job," he assured Paul. "Tell your wife you'll be gone for a bit." Paul called his wife, making up an excuse, and with that, the brothers set off.
Crack at real family time in years.
The next morning, Albert stormed into the hotel, but Peter was gone. Furious, he ran straight to his father, the judge, demanding help. But instead of backing him up, the judge scolded Albert. "You had one job, and you failed. I don't care what you do. Just find Peter and get me those diamonds." Turns out, the judge was just as corrupt as his son.
degenerate hunchback, Jimmy.
Meanwhile, Peter and Paul drove through the night and arrived at Peter's girlfriend's house. She was furious. He had disappeared years ago without a word. But after Peter explained everything, she forgave him. They caught up, and she took him to a room while Paul waited outside. Then, out of nowhere, a chimpanzee walked up to Paul. It turned out to be Peter's girlfriend's pet. At first, Paul freaked out, but then the chimp gave him a friendly nod. Just as Paul started to relax, the chimp clung to him, making him super uncomfortable. Panicking, Paul ran to his car and locked himself inside. Meanwhile, Peter quietly stole his girlfriend's ID while she was distracted and left with Paul. On the road, Paul grumbled, "Dude, that chimp was weird." Peter just laughed. "Relax, man. He's harmless." That night, they checked into another hotel. While taking a shower, Paul noticed some letters in Peter's bag. They were from their mother. Paul was stunned. His brother had been in touch with Olivia all this time. Feeling betrayed, he confronted Peter. But Peter brushed it off and finally admitted, "Mom has cancer. She doesn't have much time left. We need to be with her." Paul's head was spinning. Then, the hotel door swung open, and Olivia walked in. Paul froze. Without thinking, he bolted, jumped off the balcony, and landed on a car. But somehow he was fine. Later, the three of them sat in a bar, tension thick in the air. Paul demanded answers. "Where the hell have you been all these years? You never even tried to see us." Olivia sighed. She had been running from the cops all this time. But then she revealed something shocking. The diamonds they were after weren't just any diamonds. Back when she and her boyfriend had escaped, he swallowed them to keep them hidden. But he died before they could retrieve them. Olivia had buried his body, knowing one day she or her sons would come back for what was inside. Paul was furious. "I'm not doing this. No way," he shouted before storming off to the bathroom, slamming the door behind him. He needed a moment to process the insanity of it all. Peter ran after Paul, trying to convince him that they weren't really stealing. They were just reclaiming what was theirs. After a lot of back and forth, Paul finally gave in. Meanwhile, Albert was still after Peter and headed straight to his girlfriend's place to question her. At first, she played dumb, saying she hadn't seen Peter except for the day before. But Albert wasn't fooled. He pulled out a knife, pressing it against her throat until she caved in. Terrified, she admitted Peter had been there, swiped her ID, and vanished. Out of nowhere, a loud screech came from inside. Albert turned just in time to see a chimpanzee lunging at its owner, asserting control. Before he could react, the chimp yanked him inside and started pummeling him. Moments later, Albert stumbled out, bruised and humiliated. Meanwhile, Paul and Peter's mom had pinpointed where her late boyfriend's body had been buried. With the stolen ID, Peter snuck into a construction site and easily took off with a JCB excavator. They drove the heavy machine to the burial spot, now private property, but that didn't stop them. They dug furiously until they hit bones, and alongside them, the diamonds they had been after all along. Just as they thought they had it made, the landowner spotted them and sent his men after them. A chaotic chase broke out, forcing the trio to flee into the woods. Once they were safe, the brothers decided to rebury the remains. That's when Paul discovered the truth. Peter had set him up to get fired. Also, he'd have no choice but to join this insane mission. Enraged, Paul punched Peter, shoving him into the pit with the bones. Furious, he shouted about how he never should have agreed to this and stormed off. Fuming, Paul sat by a pond, trying to process everything when their mother approached, attempting to calm him. She reminded him that Peter was still his brother, but Paul wasn't buying it. He accused her of abandoning them as kids and only coming back when she needed them. She denied it, insisting she had always loved them and was just trying to secure their future. Meanwhile, Albert, still recovering from his chimp encounter, finally caught up with Peter and dragged him off, threatening to throw him back in jail. Paul, watching from a distance, knew he couldn't just sit by. He attacked Albert to free Peter, but in the scuffle, he accidentally left his fingerprints on a gun, putting them both in deep trouble. Albert then demanded the diamonds, promising to let them go in return. Just as things were looking bad, their mother appeared with the stolen gems. But instead of saving them, she pulled the ultimate betrayal, grabbing the diamonds and bolting. Albert took off after her, but she was too fast. Heartbroken, Paul and Peter realized their mother had chosen wealth over them. Furious, Albert threw the brothers into his car, ready to take them straight to the cops. On the way, they started arguing, blaming each other for everything. Their shouting distracted Albert, and he lost control of the car. It crashed, knocking Albert out cold. Wasting no time, the brothers grabbed the keys and took off in his car. Later, as they caught their breath, Paul called his wife, promising he'd be home soon. Peter, on the other hand, told him to go and leave this mess behind. But Paul refused. Peter was family, and he wasn't going to abandon him. He also revealed that he had figured out where their mother had gone. It was time to track her down and end this once and for all. Their mother had gone to trade the diamonds for cash, but had kept 2 gems aside, just in case. The dealer handed her a bag of cash, and as soon as she stepped out, Paul and Peter were waiting. They weren't falling for her lies anymore. Paul confronted her, demanding to know her real intentions. She tried to act innocent, claiming she planned to split the money with them. But once again, she double-crossed them, grabbing the bag and sprinting away. Paul chased her into a busy shopping mall, wrestling for the bag. In the struggle, it slipped from their hands, landing right in front of Peter. Just then, Albert arrived with the cops, surrounding them. Peter snatched up the bag and tried to escape, but Albert fired a warning shot, declaring that the money belonged to him. Albert prowled through the mall, searching for Peter, while Paul regrouped with his brother. Seeing the bag full of cash, Paul came up with a plan. He told Peter to walk out and pretend to surrender. Albert, desperate, demanded the bag, promising he'd let them go. The brothers put on an act, arguing loudly. Watching from above, their mother realized just how badly she had failed them. Paul, pretending to be frustrated, said they should never have come. Peter fired back, blaming Paul for getting him involved in the first place. Fed up, Albert shot at a nearby tree, trying to scare them, then repeated his demand for the bag. The brothers tossed it to him, but as Albert opened it, a blast of chemicals exploded in his face, just as they had planned. Blinded, Albert staggered back, and the tree he had shot at suddenly collapsed, triggering a massive explosion. With Albert out cold, their mother reappeared. Handing them the money, she admitted she never wanted them to go to jail. She then revealed her secret. She had cancer and didn't have much time left. Wanting to protect them, she picked up a gun and turned herself into the police so they could walk free. Paul and Peter took the money and left. But Paul had other plans. He went straight to a judge, handed over his entire share, and asked for the gun with Peter's fingerprints on it. The judge accepted the deal, erasing any evidence that could have put Peter behind bars. Paul returned home to his wife, who had dinner ready. Peter joined them, and for the first time in ages, they sat down like a real family. Peter then revealed he had bought a huge piece of land and registered it under Paul's daughter's name, ensuring her future. Paul, in turn, admitted he had spent all his money clearing Peter's name. They were broke, but happier than ever. Later, they visited their mother in prison. Time passed, and Paul had a daughter. When their mother was finally released, she was overjoyed to see her family whole again. In a surprising twist, Peter revealed that their mother hadn't sold all the diamonds. When she had turned herself in, she had swallowed 2 of them. Looks like they still had one last shot at striking it rich. And with that, their crazy adventure finally came to an end. So what do you think? Let us know in the comments.